so nice to see a nice full audience for a documentary during what's leading up to award season. So just a real thank you for everyone for coming out to see this film. Like I was mentioning, Joe, it's a kind of crazy week for those who haven't seen the news. Last night, 45 activists, including Joshua, were sentenced to between 4 and 10 years in prison for their part in trying to reinstill democracy in the process and democratic values back into Hong Kong's electoral system. Many of them had already been in prison since 2021. So Joe, just given where we are, what day we're at, the place and time, just love to hear your thoughts on where we are with this situation.
For sure. Can everybody hear me? Am I on?
No.
Now am I on?
Yeah.
There we go. Okay. It's been a hard day for those in the fight for democracy in Hong Kong. As Elliot was saying last night, 45 people who had been a part of the democracy movement finally received their sentences, Joshua Wong being one of them. We had expected Joshua might get as many as 8 to 10 years. That's in addition to the 3.5 years he has already spent in jail waiting for his sentencing. Joshua ultimately pled guilty, and they took a third off of his sentence. So he was sentenced to 4 years, 8 months last night. Gwyneth Ho, who was one of the talking heads in the film, who was a Hong Kong journalist and ran for office in 2018, I think, received 84 months. Gwyneth Ho is, like I said, she's a journalist. She was not a street protester. She's got a 5-year-old kid. It's devastating to get 84 months in addition to already being in jail for 3.5 years.
Yeah, and with more testimony to come in this week from some key players in the democracy movement in Hong Kong, it's definitely a news space to watch. I don't know if you've been following, even with Trump's appointment, Trump being president-elect, said he was going to weigh in on this issue with Jimmy Lai as well. So is this a good time, a bad time? Like, what's the upswing from what we are led to believe from the president-elect?
Your guess is as good as mine. That said, I'm hopeful that there's movement. I'm hopeful that we can continue to shine a light on Hong Kong. The biggest takeaway from making this film, and I think Mark will concur with me, so we made a film prior to this called Joshua, Teenager versus Superpower that won Sundance back in 2017, and it focused on the same group of kids. They were slightly younger and really looked at the umbrella movement a little more closely than we did in this film. And when we were filming in 2014, 15, 16, we were able to film very openly. I mean, Mark and I shot several scenes on the streets of Hong Kong with Joshua. There were no issues. To make this film, our team, Mark and I, were banned from shooting in Hong Kong. We will get into this a little more later in the Q&A, but we were forced to use anonymous crews. It was just a very different scenario, and my takeaway from making both of these films is, man, democracy can disappear real quick if it's not safeguarded.
Yeah, and so to that issue, Joe, I mean, Chicago Girl was when we met, when you were doing the promotion for that film. Joshua, Teenager versus Superpower, Mike Coy, and then Nathan. Your docs tend to explore and center individuals who are rising up against sometimes authoritarian, other times communist, but certainly taking on regimes, the individual versus the regimes. Even, kind of quote-unquote fun fact, Joe wrote an animated film called Underdog, but even that was called Underdog, right? Like it's like it's been a common through line no matter what you've kind of tackled. Why? Where'd that interest come from? Where'd that sense of duty come from?
My career has taken some strange turns. As Elliot said, I wrote Underdog for Disney. I did the comedy punch-ups on like Kung Fu Panda and Hotel Transylvania. And one day I came across this story of a 19-year-old Syrian American girl in Chicago who was helping run the Syrian Revolution from her childhood bedroom. And I hardly knew Mark, but I called him and we flew to Chicago very quickly after that and watched her set up a protest in Damascus. This was very early on in the Syrian Revolution. And it was just that feeling of, oh my God, I'd be talking about an unlikely hero taking on a massive power structure. It was just one of those, it was no different than Underdog taking on Simon Bar Sinister. It was just real life instead of a talking dog.
But for you also, like, did that sense of duty, was that bred in you? Is it something that you're imparting on your kids? Like working with people like a Joshua who was a teenager, like 14 years old, when everything was going down in your previous film. Still, like Nathan today, Nathan was elected when he was 21. What's your sense of purpose around this as an issue? And like, how did that get instilled in you, and what do you hope to pass along?
My goal for these films is always, can we show the world unlikely heroes doing really amazing things? I mean, we don't set out to make these films with an agenda of, oh, here's the giant issue we're going to tackle. We usually start from a character standpoint. I mean, one of the things we have all discovered in making these films is it's hard to get the U.S. or the Western audiences to care about. If I tell you I'm making a film about Hong Kong's relationship to China, your eyes glaze over. If I tell you I'm making a film about the teenagers that lit the fuse on the biggest movement since Tiananmen Square, suddenly that's a much sexier topic, and it's one you're going to pay attention to. And so our goal has always been, all right, who are these people that are doing extraordinary things, and how do we highlight their story and what they're fighting for? And if we can get you to care about them, maybe we can get you to care about the issue.
Okay, so let's get into a little bit about how you managed to care for yourself even along the way. And what I mean by that is, like, these people are putting themselves on the front line. They're being subjected to prison sentences. They're being subjected to harassment. They're putting their families, their loved ones at risk. It's not your battle necessarily to fight, but you're choosing to take your cameras, take your personnel to Hong Kong, or use Hong Kong resources and people there. Why take on that risk? What kind of risk is associated with that? Mark, if you want to address it, it's like when you see the credits, one of the first credits that come on is an acknowledgement to the crews in Hong Kong, and it just says anonymous, 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 anonymous. And I know, like, when I first saw Laura Poitras's film about Snowden, it was as much about the sneaking in of the cameras as it was about Snowden's story. You don't really choose to do that in the same way, like to focus the light on yourselves as filmmakers going through that journey. But this respect you have for the Hong Kong crews, without mentioning yourselves, is super interesting. So what happens, like what kind of risks were real to your crews? What kind of risks are there to yourselves?
Yeah, you go ahead, Mark. Take that.
No, I think that, it's interesting to go back to the juxtaposition of filming Joshua in 14, 15, 16 versus now with Nathan, or the past couple of years with Nathan. It was striking the difference to see freedom slide so dramatically between those two films. And I remember having discussions with Joe and Matt about our own precautions in the U.S. with using apps like Signal and things that could be, absolutely protected and less trackable than normal Gmail. And I was a voice that was like, guys, we really need to be this. And this is between Joshua and Nathan. And then we started using Signal and being more protected in all our communications with crew and other people. And sure enough, data started coming back about just how invasive some of this policing was in the U.S. and not even talking about the crews that lived in Hong Kong. So that was a striking, just us back at home in our edit bays, in our American homes, the potential of getting invaded by policing from abroad was high. So with that, I'll pass.
Yeah, well, and even with that, I mean, we had to take precautions that we had never had to take before. Matt, who we keep talking about, is Matthew Sultan, our editor, and Matt every night would unplug the server. I mean, physically unplug it, because we didn't want to leave it online overnight because you just never, there was a whole lot of raw footage on there with faces that weren't protected, where identities weren't hidden. And anyways, this film was a challenge. Getting footage out of Hong Kong for us was a bigger challenge. I mean, Mark and I were not allowed in Hong Kong for most of this film. We were coordinating from here, and to get footage out, we'd have 3 hard drives of footage. One would go to an in-country attorney, one gets put in FedEx, and one would go to whatever crew member was coming home. And you hope that one of those 3 hard drives makes it to the edit bay.
What kind of conversations did you have with crews, like about protecting them, or what did they ask for?
They were, to Mark and I and our team here, totally anonymous. I mean, we did not know their names. We paid in cash. They did not want to be known to us, and yet they believed so deeply in what we were doing and what the messaging was that they were willing to go work on this film, knowing what the risks were.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. You in terms of what you hope this film generates, what kind of discussions are necessary? What kind of takeaways are key?
This film, there's really 2 messages. One is obviously, don't forget the people of Hong Kong. It's become a dire situation there. Again, the news today was heartbreaking for all of us who have made these films. But there's also a second message that I really hope resonates with audiences. And again, it's the quote at the very beginning of the film. It takes years to build democracy, but it can disappear so fast. And I think that we're in a time right now. I think in this country, we've taken democracy for granted. I think we just assume it will always be there, and the freedoms that we have always enjoyed and the hallmarks of those freedoms that we've always enjoyed in this country. I think there's always been an assumption that, well, we're Americans and it'll just always be here forever and ever because that's how America works. And watching how quickly they slipped away in Hong Kong was an eye-opener for me to realize, hey, democracy is a participation sport. You need to get involved. You need to vote in your elections. You need to do the research of who you're voting for in your elections. You need to be sure that you are doing everything you can to safeguard the freedoms that, again, we all take for granted.
What do you think Nathan's thinking this week? I know you've had him present at a couple of the screenings, and given that he is away from this situation, that 45 people were sentenced to prison terms, and no doubt if he would have been there, he would be amongst them.
He would have had the largest sentence. He would have gotten 10 years minimum.
And so what, like in your conversations with him, as you touch base with him, like how has his personality, how has his risk profile, how has his fight changed or not changed?
Nathan's heartbroken. Nathan feels tremendous survivor's guilt. I know he touches on it briefly in the movie, but it's something I know he struggles with daily. I mean, everybody who got their sentencing last night, those are his friends, his colleagues. They're people that you saw on screen in that film that were not named. He feels tremendous guilt that he is still able to be out and be a voice for Hong Kong when so many can't.
And so in terms of, I know, like if you go to Joshua's site, to Nathan's site, it says, just hashtag democracy now, right? And but he's been able to give lectures at different universities and tell people about building movements and other things. What's your call to action? What do you like to kind of bring people awareness of, and what do you tell them to do as a result of this?
Continue the conversation. I mean, right now, again, Hong Kong, the needle's not going to move for a while. I mean, the democracy movement for now is going to be dormant, but that spirit that those kids ignited in an entire generation, it's still there. It will be there in some way, in some form. It will still come out. And so what I always say to people is keep the conversation going. Keep talking about it. Talk about it with your friends. Talk about it with your relatives. Talk about it with your representatives. we can't just turn our back on it and forget about it, because it does affect us. What happens in Hong Kong does have bearing here. I know it doesn't seem like it, but I know I sound like a broken record, but seeing how quickly some of the things that they held dear and had been promised, to watch them slip away. I mean, the 45 people who got their sentencing last night, they weren't the kids throwing Molotov cocktails in the street. All 45 were charged with participating in a democratic election.
Yeah, well, people weren't even sure that they did anything illegal.
It wasn't illegal at the time. They were running, when Nathan ran for election, that was within the system. It's very difficult to go from being an agitator and an activist to actually being a lawmaker. That's a really large gap to have to jump. And Nathan and Joshua and Agnes were able to do it, and were able to start to affect change from the inside. I mean, that was always the ultimate dream. We don't have to protest. We can be elected, and we can, we can make these changes from the inside. And then to see the rug pulled out from underneath them so swiftly, again, I remember when it happened, and it happened literally overnight. And everybody was stunned, and everybody thought, well, that can't happen. They were promised these things at the handover, and they've got 50 years of no change, and realizing that China had no intention of keeping that promise.
So you made a film about Joshua, right? Scheduled to get out of prison, hopefully, in 4 years. Hopefully, right? You've made one about Nathan. Who knows what his journey will hold, given that there's this bounty and this continued interest from a massive superpower. There's Agnes, there's Joshua's return, there's Jimmy Lai, there's all these other players within the system. Have you got it? Is this going to become a Hong Kong trilogy? Is there some interest?
As of right now, it is not scheduled to be a trilogy, but you never know. Sometimes Mark and I get sucked back into these things, and we did not intend on making the Nathan Law film. When we finished Joshua, we thought, man, well, the Hong Kong we've told the Hong Kong story. Like, we're good, we can move on. And then suddenly 2019 happened with the anti-extradition protests, and COVID hit, and we were sitting around trying to figure out, well, what can we shoot during COVID? What do we have archival of? And it was like, oh man, we've got interviews with these kids going back almost a decade. There's some interviews with Joshua where he was 12, 13 years old. And so we really started digging through, hey, what did we shoot in Joshua that we didn't use? What are some of those bites that we would have loved to have used in Joshua? They didn't fit. Some of the behind the scenes, some of the stuff where you hear me or Mark or our other producing partner, Matthew Torn, asking questions. And we realized, there is another chapter here to tell. And obviously, you saw it unfold. So I would never say never.
And then just lastly, their stock has risen, right? Joshua's been nominated for Nobel Peace Prizes twice now, I think.
As has Nathan.
As Nathan also. Alex Chow also. There are films about them. As a documentarian, like working with a subject, do you believe in the power of the greater visibility, the greater security, or has your experience shifted?
My experience shifted. So after we made Joshua, and Joshua was nominated for the Nobel Prize, we realized there had been 2 kidnapping attempts on Joshua before the film came out. Once the film came out, once his profile really was raised, there was this feeling of, well, they can't go after him again, or they can't kidnap him in an airport or do something drastic. And I think we sort of falsely felt, what a great win for our team. We didn't win an Oscar, but man, we saved one of the most remarkable human beings I've ever met from being kidnapped. The biggest difference I have seen between the Joshua Wong film and the Nathan Law film is this. When we made Joshua, audiences would come up to us, Western audiences, U.S. audiences, and they'd say, man, I didn't know that had happened. I didn't know that's what was going on. I knew something was going on in Hong Kong, but I didn't know it was that. Like, I'm so glad that I've now been educated. With the Nathan Law film, the reaction has been more of, man, I knew it was bad. It's worse than I thought, and I feel helpless. I don't know what to do. And again, Nathan has not given up hope. He's one of the most remarkable people I've ever gotten to work with. Truly somebody who just has a passion and a belief in both himself and in the system and in democracy in a way that is, again, just remarkable. And, he's not giving up, and we're not going to give up.
All right. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Mark. Sorry you had limited involvement. But we appreciate all of you coming out tonight. There are going to be drinks just in the lobby, in the foyer. So please come and join. Please ask questions there. Look forward to meeting some of you there. And thanks again for coming out and supporting documentary film. Thanks to the IDA.
Yes. Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight.
Thank you.